The Entrepreneur's Library, episode 250.
Welcome to the Entrepreneur's Library, the only book-centric podcast that reviews all the top-selling business books and shares authors' perspective firsthand. This is your resource to finding the next great book that will enable you to grow personally and professionally. Welcome your host, Wade Danielson.
Welcome back to the EL. Today we have Fergus O'Connell, actually a returning guest, and he'll be discussing his new book, Leadership Lessons from the Race to the South Pole. Welcome back, Fergus, and thank you for once again joining us on the Entrepreneur's Library.
Thanks for having me back, Wade.
Absolutely. So for those that didn't listen to episode 93, where you discussed your previous book, will you again take just a moment to introduce yourself? Tell us a little bit about you personally.
Sure, yeah. When I went to college, I studied mathematical physics, and then I became a software person after that. And I sort of came up through the ranks. I was a software person, so a techie, then a project manager. And my last sort of real job before I started my own company was I set up a subsidiary of a US software company in Ireland. And then in 1992, I started my own company doing project management training and consulting. And in parallel with that, then I've written a bunch of books on project management and related subjects like time management and leadership. And these days, I kind of split my time between project management training and consulting. That's about half my time. And then I write books the rest of the time. And this book that we're going to talk about today is my most recent business book.
Well, fantastic. Let's do just that as well. So thank you first off for sharing that about yourself. And now let's jump right into the book. Leadership Lessons from the Race to the South Pole. Why, and please pronounce, if I pronounce the names wrong, let me know, but is it why Amundsen lived and Scott died?
It's pronounced Amundsen, so the emphasis is on the A.
Okay. Why Amundsen lived and Scott died, which came out, and correct me if I'm wrong, but back in March of 2015?
Yeah, a couple of months ago.
Okay, perfect. And Fergus, we're going to move quickly, just like we did last time, but we're here to cover those top questions that the listener, the future reader has before they dive into your book. So
sure.
First question is, what was the inspiration behind writing this book?
Well, this is an extraordinary story because you rarely come across the same project that's carried out by two different teams. And one team is spectacularly successful and the other really screws it up. And not only that then, but each team's effort is documented because the winning team, Amundsen's team, I don't think I'm giving too much away if I say that, Amundsen, when he got back from the South Pole, he wrote a book about his journey, and Scott's diaries were found after his death. So you have an account of both projects. So it's really the rarest of case studies, really, like management case studies. In fact, I don't know of another one that's comparable. Mm-hmm. And so that was the inspiration, really, was to explore the stories of these two journeys, these two expeditions, and see what one could learn basically about project management, about well-run projects and badly run projects.
So I think the answer to this next one is fairly obvious right off the bat, but we'll go ahead and ask it. And that's, what makes your book different from others regarding the same or similar topic?
Yeah, so if you do a search, say, on Amazon under the headings Amundsen or Scott, you'll probably get about 700 hits. So there are a lot of books on this subject. But what makes this one different is that nobody has looked at it through the lens I'm speaking about of, were they well-run projects or were they badly run projects? So I've got to say as well, I have no background in polar exploration. I don't know how to ski. I've never kind of led a dog team or anything like that. But what I do know about is projects, about well-run ones and badly run ones. And this was how I looked at these two projects to see what could be learned.
Excellent. So this next question, I feel like this is probably a book that you can't just jump in and jump out of, but I want to ask that question anyway. How did you design the book to be read? Is this a book that someone can jump in and cherry pick information, or is it really designed to be read from front to back?
Well, it can be done either way. What I did to basically, like when I started my project management company, that was when I really first started writing this book, if you like, because I had read a book called The Last Place on Earth, which was a book about these two expeditions. And it seemed to me then that I began the process of trying to understand what made for good and bad projects. And after several years, I'd come up with a method which it seemed to me harnessed the positive things in projects and tried to reduce the effect of the negative things. And so the way the book is structured then is that it basically has 10 chapters in it, and each chapter describes a piece of the method for running any project successfully. So it explains what that particular element is, and then it using that as a benchmark, it sort of compares Amundsen's expedition and Scott's expedition. So somebody could read it from cover to cover, and I think it makes a reasonably exciting read because the story of the two men is very exciting. And then, so they could do it that way, or they could dip into it and just pick a particular chapter. You know, if they wanted to know, for example, about estimating projects or about how to lead people or how to track a project, they could just go to that particular chapter. And one of the things I've done is that I'm very conscious of the fact that really everybody's far too busy, you know, certainly everybody in the Western world anyway, or the developed world. And so there's a little section at the end of each book where I just kind of talk about how in a minute or two they could take the lessons from that chapter and apply them in their own working life or to their own projects. So there's a little section like that at the end of each of the 10 chapters.
Perfect. And Fergus, we're to my favorite part of the entire interview, and that's where I want to hand the mic over to you, I guess the proverbial mic, and ask you to take the next 5 to 8 minutes, really give a great summary or a deep dive so that this future reader knows exactly what they can get out of your book. Will you do that for us?
Yeah, I will. Yeah. So basically if somebody buys this book and reads it, what they will get is they will get a very common sense method for running any project successfully. So there are lots of other methods out there. A lot of them are very complicated, big folders of material. This is a very common sense sort of method. And, it has a good track record. Probably the biggest project it was ever applied to is between 2000 and 2003. In 2003, the Special Olympics World Games were held in Ireland, and they were the world's biggest sporting event in 2003. And the team of people who planned and executed that project used this method. And a lot of them weren't career project managers. They were maybe people who'd just taken a year out from their jobs and volunteered to run a piece of this project. And so this method gave them very quickly the tools with which they could run the project. And so I'll go through a little bit of the method, maybe the essential elements of it. The very first thing, and I'll do as much as I can in the time we have, Wade, and then after that, people can get the book if they're still interested. Perfect. So the beginnings of any successful project is that the goal of the project has to be clear. It has to be bounded. We talk on our courses about this idea of boxes and clouds. So a box is a very clear goal. A cloud is a kind of a fluffy, incomplete sort of goal. And right from the get-go, Amundsen and Scott were different like this. So Amundsen had only one objective. He wanted to get his people to the South Pole, be first. He wanted to be there before the British, which was Scott, and he wanted to get his people back alive. And it was as simple and uncomplicated as that. Now, Scott, by comparison, he wanted to do that. He wanted to get to the South Pole first. He didn't actually think that much about getting his people back alive. His focus, you can read it in his diaries, was very much on getting there and beating Amundsen, who was a Norwegian. And in addition, Scott had a whole bunch of scientific work that he wanted to do in Antarctica because, these people were amongst the first people to visit Antarctica, and there was a lot not known about the geography, the geology, the wildlife, all that stuff. And so one of the results of so you can see that Amundsen had a very clear goal. Scott had a more cloudy one. There were several elements to it. And I'm not saying a project goal can't have several elements, but I think Scott had them mixed up in his head. And so one of the results of this was that after he had reached the South Pole, beaten by Amundsen, and he's coming back, and he's starting to get into trouble now because he doesn't have enough food, he's not covering the distances he needs to cover every day, but he comes to a place where there are some very interesting geological specimens. And so what he starts to do is he basically takes the day out to hunt up and gather geological specimens. Now, If you were Amundsen, this would make no sense whatsoever because Amundsen was just concerned with getting his people back alive. But Scott, with his kind of confused objectives, this made perfect sense. That, he may be struggling to get his team back, but he also has this scientific work, so he wants to go and do that as well. And you can see then that the results of having a cloudy goal are that you don't really know what you're meant to be doing, and you can't sort of prioritize on any given day or in any given situation. So that was one of the most obvious ways that they were different. Now, once you've figured out the goal then, which, if you think of the goal as the destination of the journey, so your project is a journey, then what you've got to do is estimate the thing properly. And again, Amundsen and Scott were very different like this. Amundsen had this plan that he would cover 15 miles every day in his journey from the edge of Antarctica to the center. So he was going to cover a quarter a degree of latitude. He was going to cover 15 nautical miles. So you can see that visually, that's a very clear plan. I mean, it's wonderfully visual, in fact, because you can almost picture it happening on a map of the Earth. And the deal was that his people would get up in the morning, they would travel 15 miles, and as soon as they had done their 15 miles, they could stop then. So if that took them 5 hours, then they took them 5 hours. If it took them 20 hours, it took them 20 hours. Now, what Scott did by comparison was he would get up in the morning and his team would start pulling their sledges, and basically they would keep pulling until Scott said they would stop. And apparently Scott was physically a very powerful man. And so they would keep going until Scott was tired, essentially. So imagine you or I were in that situation. We were coming into work in the morning and basically we wouldn't know when we'd be finishing, but our boss would come along and tell us, and until that happened, we had to just keep on working. I mean, for people like us who do, reasonably sedentary jobs, I mean, that would be fairly unpleasant. But if you're doing the kind of hard physical work that his people were doing, then it was nightmarish, really. So the estimation of the project was really bad. The next thing is that a lot has been made of Scott and Amundsen's different leadership styles. Scott had been brought up in the Royal Navy, the British Royal Navy, and he had I think you'd regard it as very old-fashioned leadership style. And Amundsen would have what I think we would regard as very modern style. So it's like the leader as mentor rather than boss or, ordering people about. And I don't think this is that significant. I mean, they have very different styles, but I think all of us, our management styles are products of, the time we're born in and the experiences we have. And I think in that sense, both of them had styles that worked. Amundsen's would certainly, we could relate to it more ourselves, us 21st century people. But, certainly some of Scott's people, I mean, they followed him to the death, really. So I don't think one can say he was a bad leader, even though lots of people have said that. Another area where Scott was completely lacking was one of the things you need to do on a well-run project is you need to do some risk analysis. So you need to figure out the things that could derail your project. And Scott had previous experience in Antarctica. He'd been on another expedition. And on that expedition, 3 things had happened, any one of which could have killed him. So the first was there was an outbreak of scurvy, due to a lack of vitamin C. The second was that he had difficulty finding his supplies of food. Like what happened was they would lay out supplies of food, which they could then, as they were traveling to the South Pole, so that on the way back they could pick supplies and it would keep them fed and safe. And Scott used to mark his supply depots with a single pillar of ice, basically, or snow. And he had huge difficulty finding these in the sort of white wastes of Antarctica. And then the third thing was he didn't have enough food. And this is on this first expedition. So you would have thought then that given these 3 experiences, that on the second expedition, he would take care of all those 3 things. And whatever else happened, that those risks wouldn't come back to haunt him again. But as it turned out, all 3 came back to haunt him. So there was another outbreak of scurvy. Yet again, they had difficulty finding their depots of food. And yet again, they didn't have enough food. And it was a combination of not enough food and scurvy that eventually killed Scott and his entire team, because that's the way his expedition ended.
I think that's a fantastic job. I think you've given them enough to really realize whether this is their next great read or not. I think it's very, very interesting. I love when people put, these kind of concepts instead of just in a straight up business book, but put it in real life, a real life example. You know what I'm saying? Because you actually are getting to live it along with these stories. But it begs the question, which is our next one. You just went through a ton of phenomenal information, differences between, the 2 camps and those different kind of things. But if there was only one concept or principle or action item that a reader, the person listening today could get out of the entire book and everything you just discussed with us, what would you personally want that to be?
Yeah, I think it has to be this business of boxes and clouds, that the goal has to be clear. Because if the goal isn't clear, everything else kind of falls apart after that, because, you know, if you don't know exactly the destination you're heading for, you can't figure out the journey. In other words, you can't estimate what has to be done. And if you can't figure out exactly what has to be done, you can have like the biggest, most skilled team in the world, and it's not going to make a difference if you don't know precisely what they're meant to be doing. So I think it all begins with the goal. You know, the name of our little company, our project management company, it's called ETP, but the ETP stands for Eyes on the Prize. And it's this idea that you figure out the prize, the goal of the project very clearly. And once you've done that, you know, it's almost like you're halfway there.
So Fergus, our next question is on a quote, either a quote, you know, something that you wrote in the book that you feel like will resonate with the audience, or maybe something from Amundsen or Scott. So just a quote that you like from your book, and we take a minute to explain it.
Sure. There's actually a TV series about this whole story of Scott and Amundsen. It's called The Last Place on Earth. And if anyone's interested, they can actually find it on YouTube. I think you can watch it for free. It's called The Last Place on Earth. Anyway, there's a moment when Amundsen and his team of 4 people get to the South Pole. And what happens in this TV series is that the 5 of them put a hand on the flagpole that holds the Norwegian flag, and they drive it down into the snow to mark the fact that they've arrived. And then one of Amundsen's people says, we have to have a speech. Things have to be marked. And, you know, they really do have to be marked. When we do get to the end of a project and we've struggled through the darkness and finally gotten there, then we should mark these things. But Amundsen makes a little speech, and this is what he says. I think it's just wonderful stuff. He says, "I thank you from my heart for your work, your commitment, your craft, and your comradeship." He says, "I have no grand emotions, no profound thoughts to share with you. I have to confess it," he says. "I experience the excitement, of course, but above all, what I feel is not large or deep at all. It's just how good it is to be alive." And I think, really, for me, that sums up, you know, the end of any project where you have struggled at times, and maybe it looked at times like you wouldn't get through to the end, but in the end you did, you know, with a supreme effort from everybody. And I think it's just really beautiful, those words.
That is fantastic. And we'll put that at the show notes at the elpodcast.com so people can go back and reflect further on that. Fergus, our last question for you here today is really just not a book recommendation, but the book recommendation. So if there was only one book you could suggest to our audience based on the way that it impacted your life, maybe created a paradigm shift or a lifestyle shift, which book would you suggest?
You mean in my business life?
Actually, it's nonfiction, fiction, business, or non-business. Any book that impacted you the most.
Okay. So, I mean, apart from the business books I write fiction. And I've been doing this for 30 years now. And, you know, 4 or 5 of my novels have been published. I'm just finishing a novel at the moment. A couple of them have been optioned, like none of them have become movies yet. But, you know, someday we may get there. But there's a book by a guy called John Gardner called On Becoming a Novelist. And if anybody wants to write fiction, or indeed any kind of writing, I think they should get their hands on this book, because it's just a treasure of ideas about writing and the writer's life. It's a wonderful book. And John Gardner is the guy, he was a writer and a literary critic and a teacher. And he died in a motorcycle accident when I think he was 48 or something. But he's a great loss to the world. But his book is a great treasure that he left behind.
Excellent. Well, thank you. I think that's the first time we've had that one referenced as well. So Fergus, before we depart, can you recommend the best way for our listeners to not only get more information on you, but to gain some additional information on your book?
Yeah, so it's on Amazon, and I also have an author page on Amazon. I'm on Facebook. They can, just look for my name, Fergus O'Connell, novelist and writer, I think it says. And I also have my own website, which is called fergusoconnell.com. So I'm around on the internet. I shouldn't be too difficult to track down. I'm also on LinkedIn if anybody wants to look there. So it shouldn't be too difficult to find me.
Very good. Well, Fergus, thank you so much for coming on today and sharing your book with us.
Thank you, Wade. It was a pleasure as always, and I really appreciate it.
Thanks again for listening in today. If you'd like more information on Fergus or his book, Leadership Lessons from the Race to the South Pole, check out the show notes at the elpodcast.com.
Looking for your next book idea? Head over to the elpodcast.com, where Wade shares his amazing resource, the top 10 business books recommended by over 500 entrepreneurs, with you for free. That's the elpodcast.com. Till the next time, keep it on the EL.